drive soil erosion. We've seen the Rocky Mountains, I think he referred to see good examples of soil erosion, millions of years of weathering happening. Then we had John Day touch on some of the methods we can implement in our farming systems, such as focusing on ground cover, being really smart about our infrastructure, where we place it, and then the timber. That was something I, to be honest, haven't thought about, but yeah, that makes sense. Using timber that you have on farm and use them in the shape of contour banks, pretty much. And then Jim touched on all these nutritional benefits of getting ground cover right, and not just the quantity but the quality again. And so yeah, that's just a little refresher for you, and I hope you came up with a few ideas about your own property. Any questions? How about I come around and you just lift your hand if you want to share or comment on anything or have any more questions? I think you had a question, is that right? You came up.
Thank you. My first question is that the 12 are possibles at the southern coast of Victoria? Hopefully it's a comment on Victorian agriculture rather than Queensland agriculture. The next comment is, it's a question directed at all three, and I'd appreciate an answer from all three. We've had the science of rotational grazing. I wonder if anyone's done the science on the keyline plan, because I think that's, in my mind, it's one of the major secrets of land management, which we should be aiming at. Thank you.
I'll start anyway. The keyline principle, it's a proprietary system for a start. Ken Yeoman's, so we can't sell it, flog it or anything. It's up to young yeomans now to do it. The principle of it, I can't draw on anything.
Try to formulate it.
When you're looking up a hollow, a valley, it's the profile starts to go down like that, and then it flattens out like that. So you've got like an S-bend, and where that point of inflection is from when it goes to concave to convex in that curve, that's your key point in that hollow, in that valley. And if you run a line level from that point out both ways and work parallel off that system, off that line, that'll draw water out to the ridge all the time. It runs downhill. If you've got that point of inflection right, level from there, up and down, parallel to that, that'll take water out to the ridge line. Is that what you're after, or?
Does that answer your question?
Harvest? I mean, their system, they also do water harvesting into big dams and run it around into little dams and then irrigate other areas.
Okay,
like a water harvesting system. Is that what you're after?
Looks like it.
Sorry. My name's Bill Hasker and I'm a cantankerous fellow. I've known about this, and we all know about the principle of it. What I was asking has anyone done the similar sort of science that Jim's been telling us about that shows that's a profitable way of doing our land management using that principle?
No, I don't think there has been, mate. Really, not serious science. There's a lot of people who've tried it and have proved it as far as that it works and it can do a great job. It's that profitability line that really is the key to the science, and I don't think that's been done. And the fact that it hasn't been adopted in a lot of places, to me, indicates that most people who've tried it have not been able to get that profitability angle happening right. So because some big systems went in and they were pretty impressive. There was, up in Collinsville area and that not so long ago, we were looking at a huge dam with the all-level natural feed into a big irrigation area that was flood irrigated, all based on that system. But the profitability of that, I think, was an issue, and whether or not you can do enough of it in our landscapes and with the water that we get in some of those areas. Like where I think the system was developed was a fairly high rainfall area. So it might work here in this area, but maybe it's... Anyway, I don't think the science happened, to be honest.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question or comment. Have we got any suggestions? Over there, Mark. I'm hoping you're asking about contour banks. Yeah, we have a few people up in the Bowen region that are using contour banks because they have lesser rainfall than we here in Mackay. So, yeah. But that was my question. Sorry, we can tap back into that later. But let's hear from Mark.
To the soil gentleman first. Is there any science as to at what point the living creatures in the soil, the little people, stop working or slow down their function? And a question for Jim is, in a rotational grazing situation, how much variance in activity in the rumen is there on a rotational cycle where you're moving cattle from, 60% cover to 60% growth to 100% growth? Is there any science there to tell us when that activity changes?
Just to clarify your first question about the soil, are you talking about soil moisture or other things?
Microbes.
Yeah, bugs, but so what's making them slow down?
When in this area here, when we're getting that maximum deluge and the ground's full of water, do they actually slow down their function or cease their function until the equilibrium is restored, to a point where they function better? Or is there any science into that at all?
There's a heap of research going into soil bugs because it's a hugely topical thing to do. And the guys that I know who have been doing research on it are finding it very, very, very difficult to actually get sensible scientific outcomes because there's so many millions of little suckers and there's so many different varieties that all interact, and they're trying to isolate things and find out what that thing does. And they've had a bit of success with VAM and all those fungi, but other things, the bacteria and so forth, it's just huge, and they're really having trouble to getting a story there. As far as their activity goes, I wouldn't be exactly sure, but I would assume when they're waterlogged that some bugs would stop working and other bugs might even go, because there'd be anaerobic bugs and bugs that like oxygen and so forth, so there'd be probably a change in the activities. But I'll hand over to Jeff, see if he's got anything. No, he's shaking.
Actually, I think Ken and Mary might want to say something. They've been keen to share their thoughts.
Yeah, we did a lot of testing through MicroWise, the University of Adelaide, on our place with microbes during the season. What we've found is when the ground gets waterlogged, your microbes drop right off. This was most prevalent after Cyclone Debbie went through here. How the microbes dropped off after the cyclone and took a while to recover. They do recover, but what we've found here mainly is when your soil gets waterlogged, they dropped off. When it dries out a little bit like it is now and we start getting a few showers, they really raise again and keep really good right up till the next wet season, till your soil gets waterlogged again. That's our experience, and with the testing we've done, which was over 3 or 4 year period, that's been our experience here locally.
No, it sounds entirely logical.
And I know a lot of local landholders are using, microbial biofertilizers, etc., to feed their microbes and kickstart their biology in the soil. But yeah, there's definitely a fluctuation throughout the seasons. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a soil scientist here with us today, but I just want to remind you on that note that in November each year we run the Healthy Soil Symposium, similar to this grazing forum. We just focus very heavily on the soil biology happening in the, underneath our feet. And I think there's still not many answers because it's such a complex, microbial ecosystem, and it's hard to know all the answers. It's like an ocean. There's so many creatures we don't even know yet. And similar with the microbes in the soil. But they have definitely a very important key role to play when it comes to, the plant function and soil health and all of that. So just remember that, November each year, Healthy Soil Symposium.
Just to follow up on that, to just a quick test for activity of your microbes in your soil is the cotton strips, berry cotton strips or old underpants, anything made out of cotton, and just see how quickly that degrades to test your activity.
That's right. You might remember that trick from Terry McCosker about the cotton underpants. That could be a trick to see if... second part to Jim, I think.
Yep. The baton's been handed, it's coming.
Can you remember, Jim?
Yep, it's about rotational grazing. So there was 2 questions about rotational grazing. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about that and give my opinions. Now, my opinions and some of the science. There has been quite a few. I think there has been 6 or 7 sort of large research undertakings that have compared conservative continuous grazing, cell grazing, and rotational grazing for a number of different factors. Some of them production linked, some of them land condition linked. Now, most of or pretty much all of those undertakings didn't find any significant difference in any of the measurable economic factors between any of those grazing systems. The kicker is that, in particular, if we're looking at continuous grazing and rotational grazing, when the studies were undertaken, the first thing they did was to develop the long-term carrying capacities of the paddocks that they were going to use as a continual grazing. And they adhered to those long-term carrying capacities. Now, before when I asked who in the room has developed long-term carrying capacities for their properties, who put their hand up?
Do you want another show of hands?
Well, I don't think I remember. I don't think anybody did. So that's the kicker, is that within the industry, when we compare rotational grazing to long-term to continuous grazing, a lot of the time, the system that we're comparing in terms of continuous grazing is actually not sustainable. A lot of the time, the stocking rates employed in those paddocks wasn't sustainable to begin with. So when you start to think of it from that angle, the key element is rest. That's all it is. And that's the important thing that people need to focus on. Not talking about rotational grazing or cell grazing or continuous conservative grazing in exclusion, like they're different churches, but to think of how important the rest is. And I think if we look at the photos of that paddock that we rested for 4 months, how we went from, I made an error, I said there was 1 species of grass, there was 2 before we spelled it, up to 26 species after a 3.5 month spell. We start to realise that that is in fact the case. It's all about the rest. Now, in terms of utilisation rates, the number is 36. So you basically, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, what you want to be looking at is a 36% utilisation rate for your pastures. That's how much, once you go over that, you're starting to access feed that's not the best feed for your cattle.
Thanks, Jim. We've got another comment.
With what you were saying then about comparing the rotational grazing to your long-term grazing in a paddock, and you were saying about giving your paddocks a spell, isn't that the whole idea of doing your rotational grazing, so you are giving your paddocks a decent spell? Rather than, it doesn't matter, 4 weeks will give you about 3 inches of growth, if not a little bit more, depending on your year. If you split your paddocks up like we are now, we went from 4 weeks to putting a bigger mob in or doubling our carrying capacity into each paddock and make it a drag out to 10 weeks, 12 weeks, that's giving your paddocks a longer period of time. Yes, it's chewing it down, but because we run 90% of pan gold at home, and that allows us to give our shoots to get going again and start spreading, and I think that helps a lot with our buddy stopping from the dieback, where if you put a mob of cattle in a paddock, they're going to keep flogging that one spot out, especially if they find it's a sweet area. They'll just keep hammering that exact same spot every day.
Yep.
I hear some confirms here, yep.
Yeah, definitely. Once again, I refer back to are the long-term carrying capacities been assessed? Because in the work and in the research that's been carried out, where long-term carrying capacity was assessed and where the levels were reached on long-term carrying capacity, there was no variation, decrease or increase in species composition or land condition between the different treatments when long-term carrying capacity was established. Now, what I think is that when you give a grazier who are practically minded, capable people, a way of managing their property which they can understand, which is build infrastructure and use it. And that's what cattlemen know how to do. And that's what rotational grazing is. They will do that before you tell them, hey, just go get a piece of paper and spend 8 days in a paddock trying to figure out long-term carrying capacity. And that is definitely a reason why rotational grazing works. Because it works with the mindset and with the thinking of cattlemen. So yeah, I agree with you, I guess, in that regard. In that rotational grazing can have that effect. But when we come from a scientific perspective, we have to give even playing fields. And I guess that's probably a good thing, because it shows that there used to be an old fellow I used to do some work for, and he used to have this saying, whatever you do is right. So whatever you do is right.
I'd just like to remind you of our ground rule, which was like everybody has a different background and their own opinions. You know, we've been delivering these grazing forums for a while and always hear from different speakers. And often we hear from people really encouraging rotational grazing, which I'm a big fan of as well, because it's a strong linkage to soil carbon as well, you know, constantly chewing off those pastures, keeping them in the young growth phase and really stimulating plant growth. That was just my comment I wanted to share. But just to remind you all, we don't all have to agree on everything. Everybody can still have their own opinions and work out what works for them on their farm. Jackie, what would you like to share?
Different, complete. This one's for Jim. If our grasses here in the wet season, pastures, have such an issue with the water retention, if that's what you call it, like in them, so they have to physically eat so much that they only get the quantity out that they require, is there particular pastures in those tests that prove that the dry matter retention from that grass during that peak wet season is better than others? And the other question was, seeing though we've got the ability to grow so much, is there crops like, say, sorghum or something like that give you better ability for the beast to retain more dry matter rather than... That was my question.
Yep, so I think there's a couple of things there. People who can grow, it comes down to diversity again, Jackie. People who can grow a couple of different types of pasture in terms of your smaller, fresher, higher leaf to stem ratio stoloniferous species. They're great and highly productive. They're the ones that operate under higher wet weights during the wet season. If you can have some country where you have those higher tussocky species that have a higher stem to leaf ratio, but at least have dry matter that they can access through the wet, then I'm sure there's got to be some sort of advantage, although we've never looked at it from a scientific perspective, what the advantages are. The other thing is, it's probably a bit of a dirty word around places, but things like tree cropping or tree legumes within pastures, and when I say that, I'm talking about things like leukina. that bear a higher dry matter component, which is generally fairly good energy and a high protein source, to be a companion species to grass through the wet, will certainly give you a bit of an edge. But we haven't measured it. But what I will say is that's our drought. Our drought is when our production dips because it's too wet. If we maintain good pasture residual, lots of tucker, cattle can keep growing in this part of the world. I mean, I think I was saying to John Day, I was saying to somebody the other day, like, in our systems, we get a decline in our quality when we get, a month period under 14 degrees. Well, where does that happen in Mackay? So we have great opportunities here, but yeah, that's probably one of the big opportunities that we haven't measured, is how we negotiate that wet season better, particularly for younger cattle.
Does that answer your question, Jackie? Yes, I think we've got a question there from Brendan. Just come here, we've got to hear your question. Hang on.
Having a transitional paddock, so what may be your drought paddock in a rotation, so when it starts raining you put your cattle into that, so they're eating fresh forage and dry matter forage till the rest of your growing forage gets to a stage where it's at that level. So that's all I wanted to add, my 2 cents.
Put a dry bale or something in there, or?
No, as part of your rotation.
Back here so we can hear that.
That's why I walked away from it. So as part of a rotation, you'd have a paddock that would be, say, your drought reserve. So if it doesn't rain by your green date, that you'd say, I'm leaving that out of the system, or partially graze, so you've got it in case it doesn't rain. And what you do is, at your green date and it does rain, put your cattle into it, because there's going to be green shoots coming through dry feed, and that'll help the transitional period of the rumen. And it'll also allow your other grass to get past that, wet lettuce stage, is all.
Another small factor is that the native grasses will go off quicker than the big broadleaf grasses, your superior grasses. And if you've got a combination of both, it might shorten the period in which you've got all that green feed and not enough dry. So.
Okay, let's finish it. Sorry, Jim, Jeff, John, any comments to that? No? Let's maybe have one or two last erosion questions. Oh, sorry, Bruce, did you have a grazing question? Yeah, we'll finish off with you with a grazing question. And I might ask some soil erosion questions as well.
Jim, is there any studies on variation within herds on the dry matter intake? Because some animals you see all the rest of the herd laying down and they're out there eating still, or they got their head through the fence, or how big of a variation within the herd is there?
Yeah, big variation. How do I answer this? We are starting to try and build people's herd records to help them make good decisions. I did some work for a property up north the other day, and we were looking at cows that got back in the calf versus cows that didn't get back in the calf. And the big difference was, once again, body condition, and we could see it through their body condition a little bit, but mainly through their weight, which was a more accurate indicator. Shout out to bloody improving your records. It'll always help. And those ones that got back into calf didn't drop the same weight as the ones that didn't. So either they're more efficient in processing the grass that they're eating, or they're eating more of it. And I'd say it's probably more of the latter. So they're definitely there. They're definitely out there. So if you...
Yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question. There was a study done in South America on that very same thing.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah, I haven't seen that one, but I would say definitely. There definitely is. It's linked to adaptation. Some cattle get sick less, have less flies, get around the paddock more, eat more grass. And so they'll be the ones that get in calf more, and also probably generally weigh more too. So if you take into account measuring those factors, then you'll pick them out anyway, by default.
If we don't have any more grazing questions, I might ask John. So if a landholder identifies a few signs of erosion but doesn't think they're quite significant yet, when do you think it's too late to intervene? Like, when should really action be taken? When is it, what's the best time to really start thinking about a prevention or management strategy? How long can they put it off?
I guess around here, it's an interesting environment when it comes to erosion control, because even you start to get a break in the topsoil and you get a bit of subsoil exposed. I've noticed with the type of grasses and so forth that sometimes that'll just grass over because of how much rain you're getting and how much the environment and so forth is so conducive to growth of grass that erosion sites tend to grass up pretty quickly. So I guess it's a thing around here is just watching it. Like, if you start to get cattle pads or tracks that end up with a gully that's, when I say a gully, a depression that's more than a foot deep, you probably need to start doing something about managing the water and so forth before it gets too far into the subsoils, because then it could just take off. But it's an interesting environment. Like the amount of rain that you get here and just the ground cover in the system is amazing. And I suspect you wouldn't have to go far west in some of the more sloping hilly country where you would get quite a lot of erosion that's much more prevalent than in the lower sloping plains. So that'd be my suggestion. Any other suggestions, Jeff?
Oh, it's pretty easy in cropping country. When you start get rilling that you can't cross, it gets too bloody rough on your tractor to cross it, then it's a bit too late probably. So that's a bit different to grazing country. Do you get many landslides around here? Like, those landslides a problem?
We're hearing some yeses from the crowds. Yep.
So you both got answers for that. What do you do about that? Like,
can you lift up your hand? Sorry, thanks. Just wait.
I had a dozing contract for about 15 years, and the biggest thing that I found with it was the landslides were more occurring to happen where there was a shallow rock shelf. And the biggest thing that I found was the water come down and sit on that rock shelf in the big wets, and it'd sit there and just build up, and then it'd let go. I haven't come around a way of trying to think of how we could stop that, but that's just something that I've found in my experiences over the years. Because a lot of the time when I was in rake and you'd be pushing away and then all of a sudden you're dropping over one, it's too late. You've got to ride it out to go down, and some of them have been 30 feet down before you get to the bottom. So they're fair. You're holding on by your bum to be able to get it through them. But it's But that's one thing I found. It's every time there's a rock shelf there, is what's caused, like underlying a cause.
Okay. Any final question around soil erosion? Anything you face on your property that you don't know what to do about? Okay, well, I think it's time for lunch then. Yes, I heard a big yes here. Someone is hungry. I just want to quickly make a few... Thank you so much, Jim, John, and Jeff. We will hear from Jeff and John right after lunch, but first we hear from Ainsley and Rob as well after lunch. But just before we get to lunch, I just